Today we are going over Chapter 5, which is Contemporary Issues in Criminology. The learning objectives for this unit is to describe the everyday actions of police, identify police abuse of power, identify the challenges of controlling abuse of power, learn the methods to make police more accountable for their actions, describe how police services are delivered, name patrol strategies, and explain the connections between law enforcement and the communities. I want to begin this presentation off by having you consider how police are portrayed in the media, specifically if they're portrayed in a positive or negative light, and I want you to think about some common cases of police brutality. One of them may be the Breonna Taylor case, which happened back in 2020, where she was shot and killed in her own home by officers of the Louisville Police Department when they had a no-knock search warrant. Another popular case of police brutality would be the George Floyd case, which happened on May 25th of 2020, where cell phone footage was released of the police brutality against George Floyd. A Minneapolis officer, Derek Chauvin, slowly killed Floyd by kneeling on his neck. Floyd repeated numerous times that he could not breathe, but after 8 minutes of kneeling, Floyd died. This sparked the Black Lives Matter movement and protests speaking out against police brutality against minorities, especially because the police were originally called to the scene to investigate a counterfeit $20 bill, which resulted in Floyd losing his life. It is important to note that Derek Chauvin was charged with the murder of George Floyd, and police brutality, especially in this case, sparked much controversy against officers. It's important to note that officers have difficult jobs since they're the ones who respond to emergencies calls that can potentially put their lives at risk in order to protect the public. This is why it's important to analyze the kind of duties that police perform every day to get a deeper understanding of what is expected of them both professionally and ethically. Keep in mind moving forward that the media profits off of controversy and does not always show the positive that police do in their jobs. If this was an in-person lecture, I would play the video and we would answer some questions about it. However, with this being an online lecture, I highly recommend that you pause this lecture and you go watch the video, which is in the PowerPoint slide presentation that I have shared with you all. However, for the purpose of the online lecture, I have provided a quick video summary to highlight the goal of the video, which is to show that even though police may be portrayed in a negative light in the media, that in real life, not everyone has the same perceptions. So the video begins with interviewer Elizabeth Lee, and she goes to the south side of LA into the impoverished minority neighborhoods to report on how police are dealing with publicized incidents of police brutality. It is revealed that young kids typically do not know about the racial tension between officers and minorities, and that is why officers need to get involved in their communities to build up trust again between police and the public. It is also revealed that LA has a significant amount of racial tension and that social media fuels it. An important point to mention is that you can upload to social media immediately without any context whatsoever. Therefore, a lot of people are parroting information from a 5-second video without knowing the full story of what actually happened between an officer and a citizen. The video also highlights the concept that perceptions need to change, and this is because it labels all officers as bad cops when in reality it's just a few bad apples. And not only that, but a lot of these communities where this police brutality seems to be happening are labeled as violent, when in reality, they just need resources and more help. And it's also important to note that the communities in South LA want more police presence to prevent gang activity, and that they do not see all cops as being bad, and they actually appreciate when officers get involved in their community because it builds trust. So, with that in mind, what are your thoughts on the video? Do you agree that citizens being able to record any actions with the police holds them accountable? And do you agree with what Bobby Johnson said at the end there, where there are both good and bad cops? And overall, what are your experiences with law enforcement? Are they similar to what the media portrays? And what are your other thoughts on the video? To recap what we have learned in Chapter 4, we went over that police officers have 3 mandates, which are to enforce the law, order maintenance, and service the public. To carry out the responsibilities, they must interact with the public every day. Each year, 1 in 5 Americans have face-to-face contact with police officers. 9% of people who had contact with the police report that they believe that law enforcement officers act properly. However, African Americans were less likely than whites or Hispanics to believe that the police stopped them for a legitimate reason. Essentially, people's contacts with the police shape their perceptions of law enforcement and influence how likely they are to cooperate. And this is because many people avoid calling the police since they think it's not worth their time, their effort, and the cost. They do not want to spend their time filling out forms at the station, appearing as witnesses, or confronting a neighbor or a relative in court. Plus, some citizens are reluctant to assist the police because their past experience has shown that contact with law enforcement only brings trouble. But without information from witnesses about a crime, the police may not decide to pursue an investigation, so it hinders them of bringing justice to the public. So I want you to have a few questions in mind. Consider your past experiences about police. In other words, in your experience, do you call the police if anything bad happens, and do you think the police will actually help you? And it is important to note that what police are allowed and not allowed to do is dictated by judges in the court system, like the Supreme Court, for example. The court decisions establish boundaries for law enforcement action so they do not overstep an individual's constitutional rights. Therefore, by following these guidelines, officers are being professional and ethical, which is really important because the public has expectations of police to operate consistently with American values. So as long as they follow the guidelines set by the judges in the court system, they are fulfilling their expectations that we have of them. Police discretion is a hot topic in policing and is where officers are well within their rights to deprive people of their liberty, to arrest them, to take them into custody, and to use force to control them. However, officers are expected to use their discretion while performing their responsibilities. Discretion means to make wise choices in ambiguous situations as to how and when to apply the law. Discretion is very important in policing because police are very busy and they do not have the time to ask a judge for permission for every single decision. This would be very inefficient and costly, which is referred to as the judicial economy, which is the principle of using the limited resources of the legal system efficiently. It involves making decisions about which cases to hear and which to decline. Therefore, it's up for the officer to be professional and to be able to make decisions on their own because neither them nor the judges have the time to communicate with each other to figure out what the correct action to take is. And it is important to note that there are 5 factors that are essential for police officers in deciding when and how to use discretion. The first factor is the nature of the crime. The less serious the crime, the more freedom officers have to ignore that crime. Take jaywalking as an example. There are more serious crimes that police have to deal with in a day, so they're more likely to use their discretion if they see a person cross the road without walking on the walkway and no accidents or anything bad happened. Essentially, they use their discretion because they have more responsibilities to prioritize, like drug dealers or prostitution as an example. Therefore, they do not see jaywalking as a good use of their time, so they choose to ignore it. The second factor is the relationship between the criminal and the victim. Close personal relationships, like family quarrels, may not be as serious as they seem initially. Therefore, officers are wary to arrest them because people in those situations, especially a family member or a spouse, do not decide to press charges later on. Another good example of this would be domestic violence. That is where violence occurs between spouses or intimate partners, and 1/4 of violent victimizations experienced by women are in the hands of spouses or boyfriends, and it's a significant problem. However, an officer may choose to use discretion in those situations because, from experience, they do know that most of the time there is no legal action taken. Therefore, they may choose to use discretion here because they know that nothing's really going to come out of the situation. Everyone calms down. They realize that they do not want to escalate the situation any further. The third factor would be the relationship between the police and the criminal or victim. Hostile complaints are not as taken as seriously as polite ones. In other words, officers will show respect back if the suspect shows the same respect, which results in them less likely to be arrested. It's important to remember that police are humans too, and they also want respect. And they also respond better if you are respectful towards them. The fourth factor is race, ethnicity, gender, and class. Research shows that officers are more likely to investigate behavior and strictly enforce the law against those of different races, ethnicities, gender, and social class. Therefore, officers are not so lenient against young, poor, male, and minorities. The fifth factor is department policy. The amount of discretion that can be used can be authorized by the police chief and city officials. Ultimately, discretion is important because it allows more flexibility and fairness. So the big takeaway here is that police act independently. In other words, police officers possess significant discretion because so much of their work is conducted independently beyond the observation and supervision of superior officers. We count on them to be ethical and professional in all of their decisions and actions, but there is always the potential for improper police behavior and corruption to occur. On this slide, I have provided an in-class activity. If this was in person, I would break you all into groups of 3 to 4, where you would discuss with your groups how to handle each scenario involving police discretion, and you would have approximately 10 to 15 minutes to talk before presenting to the class what you came up with. However, with this being an online lecture, I recommend pausing the video and reading through each scenario and deciding for yourself how you would handle the situation if you were the cop and you had to use your discretion wisely. The goal of this activity is just to get a feel for what kind of decisions that officers have to make on the job and how those decisions vary depending on the situation. Police abuse of power. Police officers can break the law and disobey policies set by their departments through corruption, discrimination, favoritism, and failure to carry out their duties properly. Seldomly, police officers are disciplined in the events that lead to injuries and questionable arrest. For example, one officer in New York City was sued 28 times in an 8-year period, which cost the city $9 billion to settle the lawsuits. Another example would be Officer Derek Chauvin, who killed George Floyd since he was subject to 18 prior complaints to the Minneapolis Police Department and was reportedly disciplined for only 2 of those complaints. It is important to note that the public does not have access to the description of complaints against officers, which is a concern since police officers may keep their jobs despite their unjust behavior, which feeds into why the media coverage on police abuse of power angers the public so much. And that is because there is concern that police procedures that shield officers from public scrutiny and risk keeping officers employed when their behavior, if known outside the police department, might lead to pressure for dismissal by elected officials on city councils. So this leaves the question of what are the results of publicizing an officer's unjust behavior? The main argument is that it leads to accountability of officers. However, some other consequences that may not be considered is that it leads to protests, it leads to a lack of trust between the public and officers, and it leads to a lack of cooperation between the public and officers. So essentially, the consequences affect police officers' daily work lives since their number one duty is interacting with the public to carry out their responsibilities. Therefore, these consequences are very detrimental to being able to have efficiency in their work lives. So, are there any other thoughts on this topic that you may have? Any other considerations that you have on police abuse of power and how we perceive it from the media? The second video of my presentation consists of body camera footage that shows a Baltimore officer planting evidence, which took place in 2017. The evidence that was placed was drugs, and it was placed into a soup can by the officer wearing the body camera. As a result, the officer got suspended, and the charges against the alleged dealer were dropped. The incident was also reported to Internal Affairs, but I go into detail about what Internal Affairs is later on in this presentation, so I will not touch much on that right now. Moving forward, Baltimore has one of the largest body camera footage programs, and that is due to the violent protests from the Freddie Gray incident. In that incident, Freddie Gray sustained severe head injuries while in police custody in 2015 and suffered a high injury to his neck and spine, which resulted in him dying a week later. As a result, these body cameras were supposed to improve confidence, but ended up shaking it since it catches a lot of corruption on camera. Therefore, this feeds into the concept of perception is reality. Therefore, if a community thinks there are police officers who plant evidence, they lose more trust in the police and have the perception that all police are corrupt. Therefore, what are your thoughts on the video? Do you agree with the officer's statement that perception is reality? With this video being posted 7 years ago, does it still shape how we view officers today? More specifically, do most people still think that officers plant evidence? And does this video shape your perceptions of officers? Does it make you believe that most cops are corrupt? And do you have any other thoughts on the video? Another hot topic in policing is the use of force. Therefore, it's important to understand the differences between force that police officers may use. The first one being legitimate force. At times, officers must use force to make arrests, control substances, and deal with those who lack control from being intoxicated. This does not violate the law. There is also excessive use of force, which is where the application of force against individuals by police officers that violate either departmental policies or constitutional rights by exceeding the level of force permissible and necessary in each situation. This violates the law. Police brutality is a term that citizens use to describe a wide range of practices from abusive language to physical force and violence. Police brutality is not new, but today's officers are supposed to be professionals who understand the rules and the need for proper conduct compared to the untrained officers of the early 1900s. Essentially, the concept here is that our officers are arguably more trained now, therefore they should be a lot more professional than they were back in the day when the criminal justice system was first beginning in this country. Therefore, there's some questions I want you to have in mind here. The first one being, what actions from officers do you think are legitimate forces? And the second question being, what actions from officers do you think are excessive use of force? It is important to ask yourself these questions because people tend to confuse these two definitions. Therefore, it is important to be able to have a distinction of what force constitutes as being legitimate, where it does not violate the law, and one where it does violate the law and is considered to be excessive. The use of force continuum ranges from the most severe civilian shot and killed to the least severe being grasped by an officer. Research has shown that force is used infrequently in interactions with officers and the public. Research has also shown that when force is used is the type of force located at the lower end of the continuum, the least severe force. Some examples include officer presence, grabbing, pushing, and shoving. An officer may decide to use force based on the resistance used by the suspect. Research also indicates that the use of force by officers is not linked to their personal characteristics like most assume, like age, gender, or ethnicity. However, some officers may be disproportionately involved in the use of force situations, an example being the officer involved in the Chicago shooting of December 2015. After that incident, there was public protest that showcased that the officer had 18 previous complaints from citizens, including improper use of force and use of racial slurs, but he was never punished for these complaints. However, he was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 7 years in prison when video of the unjustified shooting was eventually released through journalists. And it's also important to note that even though there may be officers that are disproportionately represented in use of force situations, that the use of force by officers is used more frequently when they deal with people affected by drugs, alcohol, and mental illness. Therefore, when dealing with the average citizen, officers are not likely to use force with them. However, by law, police do have the authority to use force if it is necessary to make an arrest, keep the peace, and to maintain public order. Therefore, the questions of how much force is necessary and under what conditions force may be used are complex and spark debate. Therefore, what are your thoughts on this topic? More specifically, What conditions do you think police can use force? And make sure that you study the image I provided of the use of force continuum as you think about that question. Immediately after the death of George Floyd, the Minneapolis Police Department issued a statement to the news media with the subject line titled, "Man Dies After Medical Incident During Police Intervention." If you look to the right here, I actually provided an image of what that initial statement looked like. So please pause the presentation and read through that. It's important to note that the police spokesperson stated that Floyd resisted arrest, and the officers noted that Floyd appeared to be suffering medical distress. Nothing in that statement indicated that Officer Chauvin's knee and body weight on Floyd's neck was the source of the distress, nor did it include Floyd begging for his life. Once the video footage from a bystander went public and later on the security footage from that day, the police department changed its perspective and considered this to be an incident involving murder. This led to more investigation of lawsuits for excessive use of force against the Minneapolis Police Department, and it was found that there were instances of officers lying about what happened when they injured a citizen. Without this footage, it is hard to tell if we would have known the truth about the killing of George Floyd. The risk of lawsuits by victims of improper police shootings and other injury-producing use of force creates an incentive for administrators to impose standards for proper use of force. Training, internal review of incidents, and the disciplining or firing of quick trigger officers may reduce the use of unnecessary force. However, it's important to note that as long as officers carry weapons, some improper use of forces, including shootings, will occur because officers are humans as well, and sadly, things happen when police are on the job. Therefore, there are two questions I would like for you to consider. The first one being, why do you think that the Minneapolis Police Department issued that statement? More specifically, do you think that the police department was being genuine, where they actually thought that Floyd was experiencing medical distress that had nothing to do with the amount of force on his neck? Or do you think that the department posted that statement to try the initial statement and then the follow-up statement to try and cover their tracks on the police brutality here? The second question is, do you agree or disagree with the solutions provided to reduce unnecessary force? I have provided a video of NBC's minute-to-minute breakdown leading to George Floyd's deadly arrest. With this being an online lecture, I highly recommend that you pause the lecture and you go watch that video and answer the questions I have provided. Before I begin, I want to start off with a trigger warning by saying this footage may contain content that some people will find upsetting, so if necessary, feel free to step out for a minute. Obviously, with this being an online lecture, you can just pause the video or avoid watching it as a whole. Moving forward, the video starts off with reporter Emmanuel Saliba, who looks at security footage, cell phone videos, and police reports to piece together what led to George Floyd's death. The first footage is from a local restaurant, and the footage shows that officers arrive at the convenience store before approaching Floyd's vehicle. We can see in the footage that Floyd's vehicle is a blue Mercedes and he was on the driver's side. And to recap here, remember that the officers were responding to a call about a counterfeit $20 bill. And it's also important to note that the security footage cannot show everything, but a person parked behind Floyd recorded parts of the interaction. However, the car drives off before the officer directs a handcuffed Floyd to the sidewalk. A third officer pulls up to the scene and gets body camera footage of Floyd being questioned. The restaurant footage shows not too long after this that Floyd is taken to the squad car across the street in front of the convenience store. Another squad car pulls up and blocks the view as what is happening. Officers claim that they noticed Floyd was experiencing medical distress at this point and that they called an ambulance. Officer Chauvin arrives on the scene with his colleagues, and there appears to be a struggle between the officers and Floyd, which catches the attention of a bystander who is walking past, and that is where the footage from their cell phone came from that shows Floyd is lying face first on the ground with 3 officers restraining him. One officer is pressing his knee into the neck of George Floyd, and the cell phone footage records the death of Floyd and him being taken away in the ambulance. So after having watched this video, I want you to answer these questions. Number 1, does this footage line up with the Minneapolis Police Department's original statement that Floyd was having medical distress? And 2, is this news media unbiased, meaning that they only show the facts of what happened? The U.S. has a long history of police corruption dating back to the early 20th century. City officials organized liquor and gambling businesses for their personal gain. Much of the progressive movement's efforts to reform the police focus on combating corrupt arrangements between politicians and police officers, protecting favored clients and harassing competitors. It is important to note that corruption still exists today. In 2020, police officers in Ohio and New Jersey were convicted of taking bribes. This feeds into the definition of what police corruption is, and it can be defined as police officers' violations of law and departmental policy for personal gain or to help their families and friends. Sometimes corruption can range from accepting a free cup of coffee from a business to robbing a business to beating suspects. Corruption is not easily defined, and people tend to disagree on a unified definition. However, there is a unified definition for the 2 types of corrupt cops, the first one being grass eaters, which are officers who accept payoffs that the routines of police work bring their way. The second one would be meat eaters, which are officers who actively use their power for personal gain. And it's also important to note that illegal activity over time may be accepted as normal, and this is because officers may learn to engage in improper conduct without worrying about investigations from their supervisors if they keep order in the streets and have a steady flow of arrests and traffic citations, or in other words, as long as they meet their quotas, they do not have a fear of any intervention from their higher ups for any kind of misconduct they do. Officers follow an identifiable informal code early on in their careers that influence them not to snitch on other officers, otherwise the snitch will be ostracized. Therefore, a sense of ethics and professionalism is needed when training new police officers. This is important because administrators cannot detect and prevent all misconduct due to the amount of discretion and independence police has. Therefore, that makes us wonder what kind of misconduct will it take for the police to completely lose public trust and cooperation. On this slide, I have provided an in-class activity, and if this was in person, I would break everyone up into groups of 3 to 4, where you would discuss with your groups if the cop described in each scenario is a grass eater or a meat eater, and I would give you approximately 10 to 15 minutes to discuss with your group before presenting with the class. However, with this being an online lecture, I recommend pausing the video and reading through each scenario and determining if the cop described is either a grass eater or a meat eater. Essentially, the purpose of this exercise is to open your eyes up to how some cops may actively seek misconduct and how other cops may go with the flow where if misconduct is presented on the job, they just go with it. The main challenge in improving police accountability is to use enough citizen output to force police to follow departmental guidelines and the law without restricting their ability to carry out essential functions. The killing of George Floyd by an officer has brought a significant amount of attention to this topic. The current less than perfect techniques to control policies are, starting off with internal affairs, is a branch of the police department that receives and investigates complaints alleging violations of rules and policies on the part of officers. Depending on the size of the department, a single officer or an entire section can serve as an internal affairs unit. These officers have similar duties to the Inspector General's staff in the military. It is also important to note that Hollywood and TV shows depict dramatic investigations of drug dealers and murderers, but investigations of sexual harassment, alcohol and drug problems, misuse of force, and violation of department policies are the most common. They must also have direct access to the chief, and those in internal affairs find it stressful because their status prevents them from having close relationships with the other officers. The second technique is civilian review boards. This is citizens' committee formed by city or other government authority to investigate complaints against the police. This committee is made up by members who are not sworn officers, and as a result, the main criticism against them is that people outside of law enforcement do not understand the problems of policing. It's important to note that these members are appointed by mayors and other officials who have generally not been harsh on the police. They rarely stand up to the police chief since it is the police chief's group. Therefore, many reformers argue that the members of civilian review boards should be elected by voters instead to strengthen the independence of the board's decision-making. The third technique is standards and accreditation. They are nonprofit organizations formed by major law enforcement executives, associates to develop standards for police policies and practice on request will review police agencies and award accreditation upon meeting those standards. Departments that meet the standards of the private nonprofit organization receive accreditation. Administrators can use the standards as a management tool where training officers know their standards and can be held accountable to their actions. The fourth technique is civil liability lawsuits. These are authored by a federal statute against state and local agencies when citizens have evidence that these officials or agencies have violated their federal constitutional rights. They can increase police accountability due to Section 1983 of the Civil Rights Act of 1871, which indicates that individual officers and local agencies can be sued when a person's civil rights are violated by an agency's customs and usages. In many states, people have received millions of dollars in damage rewards, and police departments have settled some lawsuits out of court. And it's also important to note that lawsuits charging police officers with brutality, improper use of weapons, dangerous driving, and false arrests are brought in both federal and state courts. Black Lives Matter movement has drawn attention to qualified immunity and wanting to reform it. Qualified immunity can be described as a legal immunity granted to police officers and other government officials that shields them from constitutional right lawsuits if judges accept that the claim that the rights in question were not clearly defined so that officers could not have known that their actions would have violated an individual's rights. The issue regarding this immunity is that all that matters is that an officer did not know that their actions would violate a constitutional right. So if a person ends up dying due to those actions, the officer cannot be sued and found liable for their actions. Therefore, this immunity has led to many dismissals and lawsuits against police, even if the circumstances shock the public when it has been revealed that the officer was not equipped to handle the situations they did, as an example, the Mullenix versus Luna case of 2015. In that case, a majority of Supreme Court justices endorsed qualified immunity to shield a Texas officer after he fired his weapon from a highway overpass despite his supervisors telling him not to do that. Instead, they told him to wait because he had no experience or training disabling a speeding vehicle with bullets. He killed the vehicle's driver, even though he knew that the vehicle was about to be stopped by tire puncture devices placed in the road just ahead by other officers who were waiting to apprehend the man who was fleeing from officers seeking to carry out an arrest warrant. Overall, qualified immunity allows officers to avoid taking accountability for deaths and injuries from the use of force. And it is also found that prosecutors who work closely with police departments typically do not file criminal charges. And this is because researchers and new agencies that track police killings document very low rates of criminal charges. It is found that juries are more frequently acquit police officers than other people accused of killing others, and this may be due to jurors being reluctant to second-guess split decisions by officers like prosecutors do. So I want you guys to consider these two questions. What are your thoughts on qualified immunity? More specifically, are you for or against it? And do the quotes provided change your perspective on qualified immunity? So make sure to read over those quotes as you consider these questions in your head. Law enforcement attempts to structure their organization and processes to provide effective service to the public amid the reality of limited resources. Due to budget cuts and reductions in personnel affecting agencies, police departments must make difficult decisions about how to set priorities. These decisions include matters like how to distribute officers on patrol and how to prioritize requests for assistance from the public. Police administrators use evidence-based policing practices drawn from a research to employ specific policing strategies, which could be described as police strategies and deployment of resources through examination of research on crime, social problems, and previously used strategies. It is important to note that some voices urge caution against an exclusive focus on evidence-based crime control approaches because when we focus singularly on crime in geographic areas and its increase or reduction, we do not account for police and citizen interactions of non-criminal behavior, which influences neighborhood dynamics in high and low crime areas as well. Moving from that, police response can be described as being reactive or proactive. Reactive is acting in response to a notification about suspicious activity, a crime, a medical emergency, or other services needed. In other words, is when the police respond to citizen calls for service. Proactive is where police are acting in anticipation, actively searching for potential offenders without waiting for a crime to be reported. Arrests for victimless crimes are usually proactive. In other words, the police initiate actions in the absence of citizen requests. Typically, police are mainly reactive, where they arrive at the scene only after the crime has been committed and the perpetrator has fled the scene. Police do use proactive approaches like surveillance and undercover work to combat some crimes. Citizens have come to expect that police will respond quickly to every call, which has produced incident-driven reporting. And this is where they call for service, and that is the primary instigator for action. Research has shown that less than 30% of calls to the police involve criminal law enforcement. To improve efficiency in police departments, they must use a differential response system to assign priorities to calls for service. This system assumes that it is not always necessary to rush a patrol car to the scene when a crime is perceived. Therefore, the response depends on whether the incident is in progress and if anyone can be hurt. CompStat is an approach to crime prevention and police productivity measurement pioneered in New York City and then adopted in other cities that involves frequent meeting among police supervisors to examine detailed crime statistics for each precinct and to develop immediate approaches and goals for problem solving and crime prevention. CompStat has raised questions about how to integrate this centralized approach for measuring performance with community policing. Clearance rate could be described as the percentage of crimes known to the police that they believe they have solved through an arrest. It is a basic measure of police performance. The clearance rate varies by the type of offense. These measures of police productivity are sometimes supplemented by other data like the number of traffic citations issued, illegally parked cars ticketed, suspects that were stopped for questioning, and the stolen goods that were recovered. These additional data showcase that officers may work long hours while having no arrests to show for their efforts. Citizens are not usually happy with the perception that officers may be expected to issue a specific number of traffic violations each day. Essentially, citizens think officers will make unjustifiable traffic stops to impress their superiors, which increases citizen complaints about misconduct. Overall, society may benefit when officers spend their time in activities that are hard to measure, like providing services to those in need, calming disputes, and becoming acquainted with people in the neighborhood. Patrol is the backbone of police operations. Every local police department has a patrol unit. In large departments, patrol officers account for up to 2/3 of all sworn officers, those who have taken an oath and received the powers to make arrests and use necessary force to carry out their duties. Television portrays patrol officers as always on the go. However, a patrol officer's life is not always as exciting as it may seem on TV. It often involves routine tasks like directing traffic after an accident and road construction sites. In fact, most officers do not make any arrests while on their shift. The patrol function has 3 parts. 1, to answer calls for help. 2, maintaining a police presence. And 3, probing suspicious circumstances. Preventative patrol is described as when officers are not answering the scene, they make themselves visible and their presence is known to deter crime. This allows them to respond to calls quicker, and since they are the first ones on the scene, they can find themselves in complex situations and must make sound judgments and careful actions. It is also important to note that they are the reason for successful investigations and prosecutions because it depends on the patrol officer's actions when they question the witnesses and gather evidence after a crime, since they're usually the first on the scene. Overall, patrol officers have the most direct contact with the public, therefore their actions determine the image of the police and their relationship with the community. Investigations are conducted by detectives, which are police officers who typically work in plain clothes and investigate crimes that have occurred by questioning witnesses and gathering evidence. Detectives make up 15% of police personnel, and compared to patrol officers, they have a higher status. They are seen as crime fighters, and their work is similar to those in federal agencies like the FBI, DEA, and Secret Service. While performing an investigation, detectives rely on their own expertise and technical experts as well. Some examples of technical experts include lab technicians, criminal files, and forensic scientists. Despite how they are depicted in TV shows and movies, they do not work alone and typically work in teams. A TV show that has a good example of how detectives dress and how they operate is Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and there is a picture from the show on this slide, and you can see that they dress like regular people and they are not in police uniforms. Moving forward, in the process of apprehension, there may be several dead ends, but the 3 stages in the process of catching a suspect are a detection of crime, preliminary investigation, follow-up investigation, and depending on the outcome of the investigation, clearance and arrest can occur. American police have relied on science to gather, identify, and analyze evidence for a very long time. The public has become more aware of this due to TV shows like CSI, which is Crime Scene Investigators, and that's because they indicate scientific analysis like fingerprints, blood, hair, semen, and so on. Individual officers like school resource officers may receive special assignments. These police officers are assigned to high schools under contracted agreements between public schools and police departments. They provide a visible presence that may deter misconduct, have full authority to enforce laws, and can enforce school rules. They are responsible for forming a positive relationship between adolescents and police. However, teenage students may be unnecessarily routed in the criminal justice system due to resource officers issued misdemeanor citations for minor behavior issues that would have been dealt traditionally in the principal's office. There has also been evidence of racial disparities while handling disciplinary issues. There is also traffic regulation, which is a huge part of police since they regulate the flow of vehicles and investigate car accidents and enforce traffic laws. Enforcement of traffic laws educates the public on safe driving habits and provides visible service to the community. Traffic work is mostly proactive, and they also use a wide range of discretion. Moving from that, there's also special operations, where in metropolitan areas, special units are set up to deal with specific types of problems. The most common units of concern are traffic, juvenile, SWAT, and vice. Some cities have units that focus on drug and crime. Patrol officers and investigators deal individually within their daily work with drugs, juvenile delinquency, and other issues targeted by those special units. It is common for police agencies to cooperate with each other in multi-agency task forces to better address specialized problems that are not confined to a specific spot in one city. This is prevalent in large cities. Traffic duty also helps officers to catch criminals. Vice. This is where it depends on proactive police work, which is typically involves the use of undercover agents and informers. Most big city police departments have a vice unit, and they also have a wide range of discretion. The potential for corruption in this type of police work presents administrative problems. Drug law enforcement is described as many large cities that have a bureau to enforce drug laws. These agencies may include task forces that deal with organized crime or gangs that are involved in drug dealing. Sometimes sting operations may be set up to arrest the drug dealers. They sometimes reflect the goal of aggressive patrol to get targeted number of arrests and to stop street drug dealing. Critics argue that drugs should be viewed as a public health problem and not a crime problem. Instead, there needs to be more of a focus on drug treatment programs and not punishment. The conclusions of many research studies have been mixed and have caused experts to rethink aspects of patrolling. In the past, it has been assumed that patrol officers should be assigned when and where they will be the most effective in preventing crime, keeping order, and servicing the public. Preventive patrol is when patrol officers make themselves visible and their presence known to deter crime when responding to calls. The findings from the Kansas City Preventive Control Experiment is the most influential test of the general deterrent effects of patrol on crime. The findings from this study have caused many police departments to shift their focus from law enforcement to maintaining order and servicing the public. Some critics argue that police may serve society better by focusing patrol activities on service functions and counteracting crime if they cannot prevent crime through their patrol tactics. Hotspots are places where crimes are likely to occur. In the past, patrols were organized by beats, and it was assumed that crime could happen anywhere, and the entire beat should always be patrolled. Research shows that crime is not spread evenly over all times and places. As a result, resources should be focused on hotspots since the direct contact of predatory crimes occur when these 3 elements present themselves: motivated offenders, suitable targets, and the absence of a capable guardian. Some strengths of place-based policing are that it can prevent crime and reduce arrests, Directed patrol strategies focus on suspicious activities and locations that reduce violent gun crime, and crimes are more likely to be reported to the police when they are nearby in the community. Some weaknesses are that it may seem unfair to have more police presence in certain areas and not the others, and an increase in reported crimes does not mean there is an increase in crime. Foot versus motorized patrol. One of the most frequent requests from citizens is for officers to be put back on the beat. This is because this was the main kind of police patrol until the 1930s, when motorized patrol began to be viewed as more effective. Most patrolling is done by cars, but foot and bicycle patrol are used with high business and population density. Cars increase the amount of territory that officers can patrol, and due to the advances in communicative technologies, they can have direct links to headquarters and to criminal information databases. On the other hand, officers on foot stay close to daily life of the neighborhood. Therefore, they can detect criminal activity and apprehend lawbreakers more easily than the officers who patrol by cars. There is research that indicates that foot patrols can be effective in reducing crime activities in crime hotspots and neighborhoods. Therefore, there are two questions I want you to consider. Number one being, what patrol strategy do you think is the most effective? And number two being, why do you think that citizens frequently request for officers to be put back onto the beat? Aggressive patrol is a proactive strategy designed to maximize police activity in the community. Some examples would be sting operations, raids on crack houses, firearm confiscations, programs that encourage citizens to list their valuables, and the tracking of high-risk parolees. Strengths of this parole strategy are that it matters what police do in those areas, not how many police are in those areas. They focus on public order crimes, and putting more police on the streets decentralizes authority to the precinct level and institutes officer accountability. Weaknesses of this patrol strategy are based on the broken windows theory, the war on drugs, and ramblings in urban neighborhoods. The broken windows theory led officers to significantly increase stop and frisk where the public complained and filed lawsuits over it being discriminatory and intrusive. Essentially, the theory boils down to the more broken windows in an area, the more crime. The war on drugs led to a disproportionate incarceration of African Americans, and the ramblings of urban neighborhood asserted that aggressive patrol has gone too far and strained police relations with young African Americans and Hispanics. Therefore, new analysis of evidence-based policing argue that police should emphasize crime prevention rather than arrest. As a result, in 2016, New York City announced that they would issue more civil citations and reduce fines since aggressive patrol strategies target minority groups and discriminates against them. With this patrol strategy having way more weaknesses than strengths, what do you think appeals more to the citizens? In other words, can be strengths seen as weaknesses too? Community policing consists of attempts made by police to involve residents in making their own neighborhoods safer. This is based on the belief that citizens are often concerned about local disorder as well as crime in general, that the strategy emphasizes the cooperation between the police and citizens in identifying community needs and determining the best way to meet those needs. Community policing is seen as a solution to problems with crime fighter stance that prevailed during the professional model era. Community policing has four components to it. 1. Focusing on community-based crime prevention. 2. Changing the focus of patrol activities to non-emergency services. 3. Making the police more accountable to the public. And 4. Decentralizing decision-making to include residents. Essentially, community policing requires police officers to view citizens as both customers to be served and as partners in the pursuit of social goals, rather than as a population being watched, controlled, and served reactively. This strengthens police effectiveness for order maintenance and service. It's important to note that departments that view themselves as emphasizing community policing do not necessarily share identical patrol strategies and incentives. Some departments might focus on solving problems related to disorder and crime, while other departments focus on strengthening local neighborhoods. Problem-oriented policing is described as a strategy that seeks to find out what is causing citizens to call for help, so the police seek to identify, analyze, and respond to the conditions underlying the events that prompt people to call the police. This is a central feature of community policing in many departments. This allows officers to enlist community agencies and residents to help resolve those issues. Using this approach can impact various crimes like drug sales and homicide, while also allowing police to not just fight crime, but to address a broader array of other problems that impact the quality of life in the community. Overall, police administrators must deal with many issues to successfully develop and implement strategies. Even when researchers agree on which patrol practices are the most effective, those practices often run counter to the desires of department personnel. For example, foot patrol may be a key component of community policing, but most officers prefer to patrol in their squad cars because they're able to cover more area. Research conducted in the last 30 years has raised many questions about which patrol strategies police should employ. The rise in community policing has shifted law enforcement towards problems that affect residents' quality of life. The continuing development of evidence-based policing results in a focus on hotspots. Neighborhoods with crime hotspots may require different strategies than neighborhoods where residents are concerned mainly with order maintenance. Many researchers believe that the traditional patrol efforts has focused too narrowly on crime control, neglecting the order maintenance and service activities that police departments were originally framed around. Critics urge for police to become more community-oriented. The current era of budget cuts and reductions in police force personnel constricts many police chiefs' flexibility in their use of officers. Time will tell if financial problems will reduce various forms of patrol, or if they'll push departments towards a purely reactive or a hotspot emphasis. Some cities have already faced the worst-case scenario of having every patrol shift reduced to a few officers, so they cannot respond to all calls about felonies. So the next question is how the national effort to combat terrorism will affect local police patrol agencies remains uncertain. This is because since 9/11, state and local police have assumed greater responsibility for investigating bank robberies and other federal crimes as the FBI and other federal agencies devote significant attention to catching people with terroristic organizations. Police are the first responders in a bombing or other terroristic attacks. The new concerns about terrorism do not alter traditional police responsibilities, but they do provide new challenges for police administrators in applying how to train and deploy their personnel. Overall, what do you think the future of patrol will look like? Police work in a U.S. city can be very difficult since it involves hours of boring, routine work interrupted by short spurts of dangerous emergency calls. Officers today must deal with situations that range from helping the homeless to dealing with domestic violence to confronting shootouts at drug deals that went wrong. Policing actions can be mishandled by officers, and officers' actions can be misinterpreted or misunderstood by the public. These elements lead to the public's distrust of the police. Police executives face challenges for developing training and supervision of officers to limit errors and misbehaviors. They must also be transparent and share information with the community's residents to reduce the risk that police will no longer have their support and assistance. Special populations are where urban police forces must deal with a complex population since city streets are growing with the numbers of people suffering from mental illnesses, homelessness, alcoholism, drug addiction, and serious medical conditions like acquired immune deficiency disorder, or commonly known as AIDS. Police may find runaway youth and children victimized by their parents' neglect. Some factors that contribute to the increase of people on the streets are overcrowded jails, cutbacks in public assistance, and the closing of psychiatric institutions. It's important to note that many of these people do not commit crimes, but their presence in the streets disturbs their fellow citizens and creates fear of crime and disorder. Police officers cooperate with social service agencies to help individuals and respond to requests for order maintenance. Police departments use crisis intervention teams, and some cities use mobile units to restrain devices and medical equipment to handle disturbed people. Due to the push for police reform from the George Floyd protests, many advocates hope to see resources directed to social service professionals who are trained and experienced in dealing with people experiencing illness or crisis. Unfortunately, police officers' interactions with troubled people tend to lead to tragic consequences, like the use of lethal force against the deaf or mentally ill, whose people's actions are perceived as a threat. Reformers hope that removing officers from initial crisis intervention will increase the effectiveness of such interventions and reduce the risk of physical harm. Dealing with special populations is a major problem for police in most cities. Each community must develop policies so that officers will know when and how they are to intervene when a person may not have broken a law but is upsetting residents. Inevitably, officers will make mistakes in some situations. Officers must also protect themselves in encounters with people affected by health issues. For example, police officers must frisk individuals being taken into custody and may have grounds to frisk people who may not have ultimately be arrested. When an officer conducts a frisk and search, people may have a weapon, which can endanger the officer and other people around them. However, some people may have needles for drug use, so the officer is at risk for getting pricked by the needle, which may contain infectious diseases like hepatitis, HIV, and other blood-borne illnesses. Close contact with the community residents can lead to exposure to saliva and other bodily fluids that may transmit infectious diseases. The COVID pandemic of 2020 made officers more aware of the risk of acquiring infectious diseases merely from breathing in the virus while talking to individuals and having close contact with people while taking them into custody. Across the country, hundreds of officers tested positive for COVID and dozens died, which gave good reason for officers to be fearful and careful with their inevitable close contact with the residents of the community. Therefore, I have two questions for you to consider. The first one being, do you think that an officer's safety in dealing with the public gets much thought and attention? And number two, when the pandemic was going on, do you think people were concerned about officers becoming affected with COVID? In the last half of this century, the racial and ethnic composition in the U.S. has changed. During the mid-20th century, many African Americans moved from rural areas of the South to northern cities. In recent years, immigrants from Central and South America have become the fastest growing demographic group in many cities. People with family roots in Spanish-speaking countries are rapidly growing within the nation's population and outnumbering African Americans. Immigrants from Eastern Europe, Russia, the Middle East, and Asia have also expanded their presence in many states. Essentially, policing requires trust, understanding, and cooperation between officers and the public. In a diverse society, relations between the police and different racial, ethnic, and religious groups are complicated by stereotypes, cultural variations, and language differences. This makes people more unwilling to call for help and provide information about wrongdoing because there seems to be a disconnect between police and a diverse public. Many immigrants come from countries that have different cultural tradition and laws and are not familiar from the American police. Some immigrants cannot communicate easily or fluently in English, and overall, a lack of familiarity with the immigrant's cultural background, difficulties in communicating, and excessive suspicion can create the risk that officers will violate the American principle of all people being treated equally. In sum, have you ever considered the difficulties of policing in a diverse society? Police officers may attribute undesirable traits to members of minority groups just like other Americans have limited personal experiences and unfamiliarity with people from different backgrounds. Treating people based on stereotypes creates tensions that harden negative attitudes. Public opinion surveys indicate that race and ethnicity play a key role in determining people's attitudes towards the police. Therefore, young, low-income men from different racial and ethnic groups historically victimized by discrimination carry the most negative attitudes towards the police. Residents of inner cities significantly distrust the police, and all aspects of an officer's duty can suffer when police officers in the communities lack cooperation and trust. African Americans and Hispanic people are disproportionately chosen for searches and other unwanted encounters with the police, so they may have resentment towards police. African American drivers are 3 times more likely than white drivers to be subject to investigatory traffic stops that were not based on actual traffic violations and are also 5 times more likely than whites to be searched for such stops. Additionally, after 9/11, there has been targeted hostility towards Muslims, where police departments conducted a surveillance on Muslims and also stopped them for questioning without justification and other activities based on terrorism fears. Very few of the 400 million Muslims living in the U.S. support or sympathize with the small groups that seek to attack the U.S. In fact, white supremacists have murdered more Americans in recent years than any other group that receive attention for potential terroristic threats. Essentially, effective policing to combat terroristic attacks or crime requires law enforcement officials to develop good relationships within the community. This encourages people who observe suspicious activity to share the information with the police. Therefore, stereotypes and exaggerated suspicion based on religion, ethnicity, or race are counterproductive. Diversity in the U.S. is not defined solely by race, ethnicity, and religion. In the 21st century, there has been an increase in awareness, visibility, and legal protections for gay, lesbian, and transgender individuals. The U.S. Supreme Court enhanced inclusiveness with decisions that legalized same-sex marriage and applied federal employment discrimination law for the protection of LGBTQ individuals. However, those in the LGBTQ communities feel that the police do not provide them with equal treatment by refusing to respond properly to their claims of victimization or by failing to treat them respectfully during interactions. This leads to feelings of concern about fair policing since people are being targeted for harassment and violent victimization due to their sexuality and gender identity. And in the first half of 2020, there was evidence of a surge in hate crimes, including murders against transgender individuals. Ultimately, it's important for police to learn about the diversity within their communities, set aside their own stereotypes, and commit themselves to providing equal justice under the law. Thus, there is an increase in police training on LGBTQ issues. Two questions I would like you to consider is, do you think that LGBTQ training is enough to reduce the injustice towards those in that community? And do you have any other thoughts on this topic? Community crime prevention is described as programs through which criminal justice officials cultivate relationships with and rely on assistance from citizens in preventing crime and apprehending offenders within neighborhoods. The federal government has funded and facilitated intergovernmental cooperation and citizen involvement through a variety of programs like Project Safe Neighborhoods. This is an anti-crime program with a significant focus on anti-gang efforts and the reduction of illegal firearms. Additionally, more than 6 million Americans belong to citizen crime watch groups, which often have direct contact with police departments. Many communities use the Crime Stopper program to enlist public help in solving crimes. Television and radio stations present the unsolved crime of the week and sometimes give out cash rewards for information that leads to the conviction of the offender. Even though these programs help solve some crimes, the number of solved crimes remains small compared to the total number of crimes committed. Additionally, here are two questions to keep in mind. What are your thoughts on these community crime prevention programs? More specifically, do you prefer one over the other? And do you think there's anything criminal justice officials can do to make these community crime prevention programs better? This completes my presentation. I hope you all learned a lot. However, if you have any thoughts or questions, please let me know.